I'd love to talk about your experience on Nanny, because when we were, talking off camera, I think we talked about how that job impacted your experience and your knowledge as an underwater grip. So could you give us some background on, what that film was about and what your role was on the Nanny?
Nanny was a great film, low budget feature. Rena Yang was the above ground cinematographer, and Ian Takahashi was the underwater DP that they brought in. That was a unique film too because it was a little bit more of an advanced sequence. It was a couple days in the pool, some above the surface underwater elements and below that. I felt like a kid in a candy store during that shoot because Ian Takahashi is one of the cream of the crop, biggest, most wonderful, successful underwater people that I've ever met. And having the ability to work with him was like 4 years of film school in a week, because he was incredibly approachable, incredibly knowledgeable, didn't kind of like hold his secrets to his heart. He was trained and like came up under Pete Romano, who I spoke about earlier, the Hydroflex owner and developer and stuff like that, that he approached underwater in a way that I had never conceptualized before. I was the underwater key grip for that, above water as well, but that was a unique situation because the sequences happened a little bit later in the schedule, but like everything, the project just didn't have any money, but they threw a lot of money at this sequence. So it kind of definitely helped. And working on that film was one of the first times that I ever was like, oh, what we do above the ground can be used below the surface as well. And it was like little things like blacking out the pool. I had never blacked out a pool before completely. So in the script, it's this, Mawawatu was the actual like character. So it's basically this like ancient character that's kind of like compressing and like haunting this woman as she gets in the pool with the child that she's babysitting. It's like a pool class. So basically like, oh, they get into the water and then it's like, boom, this flashback of this little creature following them, yada, yada, yada. So a lot of the sequence happened under the surface in like a black void. So we had to black out basically the whole pool. And the techniques that like Ian and I kind of came up with, because I worked with them, they wanted to bring in like a key grip from LA, who's like I'm a fanboy here for a minute. I don't even know the guy's name, but his name's Soda Pop on Instagram.
Perfect.
So yeah, I
think that checks out.
But like, he's like Ian's key grip. And he is a proper like underwater key grip. And some of the stuff that I would see on his Instagram, I'd be like, what the fuck, dude? Like, this is cool. And it's just like his techniques that he uses are really incredibly interesting. And working with Ian was really great because I felt very confident as an above the water key grip and very confident as a diver, but I didn't really I wanted to think I had the confidence of an underwater key grip as well, but not the practice. And he taught me like certain things on like how to sink water rags as opposed to, in gripping, we have these things called solids. So they're basically just like black textiles. And they're almost like a fabric that has this flame retardant and chemical element to it to prevent it from catching on fire, just like would be in like a theater. So like not putting those in the water, putting water solids in the water was like a huge thing of how to do that. And then basically what he was how to properly do that, because if you put a 40 by 40 piece of fabric in the water, it's just going to literally float at the surface. No, it doesn't go down at all. That's what's crazy about it. It literally just sits there at the surface. So being able to sink those solids, this is just like, I'm going to kind of break down like in a nutshell, like what the whole process was. Getting those to the bottom was incredibly challenging. And I was like, oh, we'll just throw some sandbags in there. And he was like, no, you can't use sand. You can't use sand in the water. And I was like, well, why? It's heavy. It's 30 pounds of weight. Why can't you use sand in the water? He's like, sand disperses in the water. So your 30-pound sandbag becomes zero once it hits the surface. You might get down a low eventually, but it's just going to settle. It's going to slowly disperse and dispense as it goes down there. And just like if you were at the surface of the beach, kicking up sand creates a ton of sediment in the water. So he was like, no, we're not going to use sand. We're going to use shot, metal, lead, certain types of lead that will just sink and it won't create sediment in the water. I was like, it's really smart. So we ended up using metal shot bags, which, in a nutshell, created its own thing, because if they're brand new shot bags, it's great, no problem. But if it's a shot bag that's been used in the water for a while, there is a little rust that, comes out to it. So we're like, okay, so maybe if we don't have time to let the sediment, settle from using these, why don't we just use workout weights or dive weights, and wrap them in black grid cloth so that they're black and they can just sit on top of there, because looking at it, you're not going to see that weight. It's going to be so dark that it's like, okay, cool. So we had to get that stuff down to the bottom, and it took, we had a day of prep, I think, on Nanny, which to me, when we were going into the sequence, I was like, yeah, what do we need the day for? And another thing that Ian kind of brought up was just like, oh, well, what we need the day for is we need to let the rags settle, let them sit on the bottom, and let that sediment kind of settle so that when we get into the water, it's crystal clear water. And he said a technique that like Soda Pop was doing, that Soda Pop will do is come in before the rig and before the shoot, and he'll basically vacuum the bottom of the pool. And like, you're like, oh, why would you like vacuum the bottom of the pool? But he basically just cruises and just takes all that sediment that's been settled up into the vacuum versus putting it into the water to limit your visibility. And I was like, oh, that's really quite interesting. That's a really cool element, because also we were having problems with our rags billowing because they were sitting on the filtration system. So what we had to do, we wanted to kill the filtration eventually, but the longer you kill it, the more sediment that just forms in the water. So what we did was we built little black like milk crates and put black milk crates over put little black milk crates over the filtration system, and then cut holes in the rags so that it was just like a little black billow.
Oh, weird.
So you didn't see it, so that it could still filter that water that gets in there, because water's still going to get there, but you didn't have to necessarily kill it completely, which is like, oh, that's really cool. That's an awesome technique as well, because the more air you put behind any of these textiles, the more bubbles that'll form, the more, the bottom starts raking up and stuff like that. So that was like the first element. I was like, cool, this is like no brainer, but I would have never thought about that.
Right.
And another element was we were kind of getting into the sequence, and he was starting to film this actor that was just had to basically be a couple feet below the surface, because in the scene it's just like when she goes down, then she sees this monster, or not monster, but element of horror, because it's a horror film, that he's like, well, why don't we put I need you to go get a ladder. And I was like, well, we're gonna put the ladder, we're at 13 feet of water. And he was like, put an 8-step right here. And that was like one of those pivotal moments to me where I was like, that makes this, I don't know why, but it because naturally everything about you, you're like, oh, it just shouldn't happen. But he's like, well, you need to fix yourself in a 3D environment. And by putting a ladder down, whether it's you as the camera operator, making sure the lens is exactly where it needs to be every single time, helps with your composition, helps with your framing. But also being able to put your actor on it. If you're not shooting full body, put them on an weight their feet down so that they can kind of like sit on a ladder, or give them something to sit on at depth. And the safety diver, once they're ready, pulls their rig, and that's that. And I was like, man, that makes so much sense, because in water, you're constantly moving. You're never fixed, and you're never in one position. So that was one of those moments where I was like, yeah, that makes sense. And using the knowledge that I have above the water and below the surface, like, this is incredible. And that was incredibly useful to me to help with composition and framing in the underwater work that we do. And so I was like, cool. So it was like one after another after another. And then basically what we did after that was we're filming we try to kind of not limit yourself into like shooting into the side of a pool and shooting in the deep end, because it gives you the widest focal length that you can versus, and getting away from the slope. So being on the slope of the pool, I mean, if you see on a pool, especially being on like the downward slope of a pool, that's very hard to just sit on because things will slide down. Rigging a ladder is very difficult because nothing wants to sit. So like he helped me figure out a way to like level a ladder on that slope to try to avoid that. Where I was like, man, all these little like details and these subtle little things that I would have never kind of thought about, because at this point in my career, I was just approaching the underwater world of just being like, oh, you just go in the water with a camera and you film it.
Yeah.
You know?
So how do you level something on a slope like that?
It's good to know. So basically what we had on that job was like a small little piece of decking. And basically you had to level the deck. Like put one side on here, weight it down.
Like a steel deck.
Yeah, exactly. Weight it down one side and do metal feet into like a swivel flange, and basically hit that edge, and then weight back up to the shallow end. So you'd basically like tie weights back to the shallow end that sits flat, and then it prevents it from sliding down.
Huh.
Yeah. And, you know, just weighting down a ladder was like one of them, like was the quick, easy solution when the deck, because like the deck has to be pretty specific for like this framing, but it's like, oh, we need to go over left a couple of feet.
But so scouting your pool can be important too. So you know
100%,
that,
100%. Yeah. And that was something that I was like, man, that's really wild. And that's just from the like gripping, rigging element of it. With those like those three things were very useful to me and my knowledge of the underwater work in form of like a compositional element. And then the like lighting element kicked in, where I was like, okay, cool. How are we going to light this scene? Because he approaches, he's an underwater like cinematographer. So he approaches underwater work as a light, like from a lighting standpoint as well, and a shaping like standpoint, which I was like, oh, cool. This is where my now this is where my like juices started flowing, because I was like, I'm a lighter. I love lighting. I love shaping. I love contrast. I love creating, you know, interesting elements on how light hits your face. And like, that's like where I started to do. So we got down to like the underwater lighting of it. And it was the first time that I ever worked with, I think we had a couple hydropars, like 1.2 hydropars. We had, Astera tubes. So it was like underwater Asteras. And basically we were putting like 4x4 diffusion frames and C-stands under the water to like shape the light and create contrast under the water. And then it's like, oh, cool, Stratton. So we're also, you know, it's like a 40 feet across, whatever the pool was at that moment. And he's like, we're going to put an ultra bounce on the backside behind camera to basically cut all of that passive fill from the white element of a pool, the foreground element of the pool, to basically, it's like, then if we need some fill, we can, you know, activate the ultra bounce, but it cuts that film so that you can light and shape the actor correctly by like, cool, all right, we have this, you know, underwater a 60 that has a magic cloth in front of it, and then like cutting the bottom of it with a metal flag to keep it off the lower half of their body. So it's just lighting their, you know what I'm saying? It's like stuff like that. I was like, oh, you can do what we do above the surface below. It just takes some time and it takes like the wherewithal to actually like do these things. And that was the first film that I'd ever worked on that I was like, this is possible. You know, it was like my abyss moment where I think people like, and I know it's not like the stakes were not that high, but like this was like one of those reckoning moments where I was like, you can do things in the water that I would have never thought were possible.
I like that the electric side is like, you have to have all these specialty lights that are designed to go, and the grip side still just throw a C-stand in the pool.
Throw a C-stand.
Ladder.
Well, that's like why it's ladder, shot bags, no problem. That's basically
it's more about cleaning the equipment afterwards than it is
100%.